I never thought at 61 I'd be listening to my ex-husband brag about destroying my life on a podcast. But there I was, standing in my empty Chicago apartment, holding my phone as Julian's voice filled the room with casual cruelty. Maribel, oh, she's been phased out completely. Honestly, it was time. She was holding us back from evolving with modern audiences. The interviewer laughed, and Julian continued, sometimes you have to cut dead weight to move forward. Business is business. 37 years together, 23 years married. 15 years building our television empire from nothing, or reduced to dead weight. But Julian made one crucial mistake. He forgot that I spent decades in television, which means I know exactly how to make someone's worst moment go viral. The question is, when someone destroys your life publicly, how far are you willing to go to make them pay? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The apartment felt different after hearing those words. Not smaller exactly, but somehow less mine. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, the same granite surface Julian and I'd picked out together 15 years ago when we bought this place. Back then, we were celebrating the success of morning conversations with Julian and Maribel, and money felt endless. Now the counter just reminded me of how naive I'd been to put his name first on everything. I walked to the living room window and stared out at Lake Michigan. The water stretched endlessly, grey-blue under the October sky, and I found myself thinking about beginnings, how everything started in 1986 when I was 24 and Julian was 26, both of us hungry young producers at WG and trying to make our mark in Chicago television. I was the one with the vision. I'd grown up in Pilsen, watching my mother clean houses for wealthy families while dreaming of something bigger for her daughter. Television felt like magic to me, the power to reach into people's homes and tell stories that mattered. Julian was different. He saw television as a ladder, each show a rung higher toward fame and money. You're the brains, Maury, he used to say in those early days, when we'd work until 2 in the morning crafting show concepts in my tiny studio apartment. I'm just the pretty face. He'd flash that smile that made camera operators forgive his mistakes and executives approve bigger budgets. I should have paid attention to how easily charm became manipulation. Our first break came in 1989 when WCIU gave us a shot at a week and morning show. Second Cup Sunday was supposed to be a throwaway time slot, but I had ideas, real ideas. I wanted to talk to people others ignored: working mothers, immigrants, seniors starting over. Julian wanted celebrities and trending topics. We compromised, which in television terms meant I wrote the content and he took credit for the ratings. The show caught fire. Within 6 months, we were syndicated in 12 markets. Within 2 years, we had a development deal for weekday programming. By 1995, Morning Conversations was a national phenomenon, and Julian was being profiled in TV Guide as Chicago's brightest rising star. The articles always mentioned me as his talented producer or the woman behind the success, never as a partner. Never as an equal. I should have seen the warning signs during our wedding in 1998. Julian insisted on a prenup, which he explained as standard practice for media personalities. I was so in love, so caught up in the fairy tale of building an empire together, that I signed without really reading the details. My brother Tony tried to warn me. Maury, this contract doesn't protect you, he said, sitting in my kitchen the night before the wedding, reading through legal documents while I fussed with flower arrangements. If anything happens to the business, you're left with almost nothing. Nothing's going to happen, I told him. We're partners, we're a team. Tony just shook his head. Business partnerships and marriages are different things, sis, don't confuse them. But I did confuse them. For 23 years, I confused them. The television industry changed around us through the 2000s. Reality TV exploded. Social media shifted how audiences consumed content. Streaming platforms disrupted traditional broadcasting. Through every transition, I was the one adapting our format, finding new revenue streams, negotiating digital rights deals. Julian was the face, but I was the architect. I remember the exact moment I realized our marriage was over. It was March 2019, and we were at a network party in Los Angeles. Julian was holding court near the bar, telling industry executives about his vision for expanding into podcasting and digital content. A young producer approached me and said, "It must be amazing being married to such a creative genius. He is talented." I replied diplomatically, "I mean, to come up with show concepts like that completely on his own. Incredible." I excused myself and went to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection and finally admitted what I'd been denying for years. Julian hadn't just taken credit for my work, he'd convinced the entire industry that my ideas were his. Even worse, he'd convinced himself. The divorce was finalized in October 2021. Julian kept the house in Lincoln Park. I got this apartment and what was supposed to be 50% of Becker Ortiz Productions. That was the deal. That was what the lawyers negotiated. What I didn't anticipate was how creative Julian could be with accounting. Restructuring for efficiency, he called it when he moved production to a new company called Becker Media Group in early 2022. Suddenly, all the valuable assets, our show library, syndication rights, development deals, belonged to the new entity. Becker Ortiz Productions became a shell company with minimal value. I owned 50% of nothing. I fought it through lawyers for 18 months. I presented evidence that the new company was essentially stealing our intellectual property. I showed contracts proving my creative contributions. Julian's legal team buried me in paperwork and postponement tactics until my savings ran out. In television, as in most industries, justice costs more than most people can afford. By spring 2023, I was officially out. Julian sent my final severance check, 6 months of health insurance, and enough money to cover 3 months of rent, along with a letter expressing his gratitude for my contributions to the early phases of his career. My contributions to his career. I should have been broken. I should have retreated into bitterness and self-pity. Instead, I did something that would have surprised my younger self. I started documenting everything, not just the obvious financial misconduct, though there was plenty of that. I documented every time Julian took credit for my ideas in meetings, every instance of him dismissing female employees while promoting less qualified men, every contract where he inflated his role and minimized mine, every email where he expressed private contempt for the audiences we claimed to serve. I had access to everything because Julian never bothered to remove me from company email systems or cloud storage accounts. In his mind, I was no longer a threat, just another middle-aged woman he discarded after extracting her value. He underestimated the power of a woman who'd spent 37 years in television and had finally stopped pretending his success was more important than her dignity. The documentation grew into a methodical project. I created detailed timelines, organized financial records, and preserved every piece of evidence that proved Julian Becker built his empire on foundations laid by others, primarily by me. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it all, but I knew someday the right opportunity would present itself. That opportunity came this morning, in the form of a podcast that Julian probably thought no one important would hear. The Media Maverick Hour was hosted by some 20-something influencer trying to break into traditional television. The audience was small but engaged, and apparently someone had asked about me, Maribel Ortiz. Julian's voice had that dismissive tone I remembered from our worst fights. Look, I have tremendous respect for what she contributed in the early days. But television is a young person's game now. You have to evolve or get left behind. Maribel was comfortable with how things used to be done. I needed to think about the future. The interviewer pressed him. But wasn't she a founding partner? Didn't she co-create most of your successful shows? Julian laughed, actually laughed. Founding partner is a generous term. She was invaluable as a producer and researcher. But the creative vision, the concepts that really connected with audiences, that was always my wheelhouse. Sometimes you have to make tough business decisions. I couldn't let nostalgia hold back the company's growth. That's when he said it, the line that changed everything. Sometimes you have to cut dead weight to move forward. Business is business, dead weight. 37 years of my life, and I was dead weight. I played the clip 3 more times, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because I needed to feel the full force of it. Julian had finally shown his true face to the world, and he'd done it. With the casual cruelty of someone who believed he was untouchable, he was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. But mostly, he was wrong about underestimating what a woman with nothing left to lose could accomplish when she stopped caring about being polite. I walked to my desk and opened the laptop that contained 3 years of carefully organized evidence. Somewhere in this apartment was the original partnership agreement that proved Julian's lies. Somewhere in my files were recordings of meetings where he'd admitted to stealing concepts. Somewhere in my documentation was enough truth to destroy the reputation he'd built on the foundation of my forgotten contributions. But I needed more than evidence. I needed a platform. I needed an audience. I needed someone willing to let me tell my story in a way that Julian couldn't control or spin. I needed to make him face the truth on live television. The box sat in my bedroom closet like a time bomb waiting to explode. 3 years of evidence, organized in manila folders with labels written in my careful handwriting, financial irregularities, creative theft documentation, employment discrimination, contract violations. Each folder contained enough material to destroy Julian's reputation permanently, but I'd never known how to deploy it effectively until now. I pulled the box down from the top shelf and carried it to my kitchen table. The weight felt substantial in my hands, not just physically, but emotionally. This was my life's work reduced to paper trails and digital files. Proof that I'd existed, that I'd mattered, that Julian's version of history was a carefully constructed lie. The first folder contained copies of our original partnership agreement from 1989. I'd found the documents in storage last year, yellow with age, but legally binding. The language was clear: equal partners in all creative and financial aspects of any television production company we might establish. Julian's signature looked younger somehow, more uncertain. Back then, he'd needed me more than I'd needed him. I photographed every page with my phone, uploading them to a secure cloud folder I'd created specifically for this purpose. Modern technology had advantages that my younger self couldn't have imagined. In 1989, evidence could be destroyed with a match and a wastebasket. In 2023, the truth could live forever in multiple digital locations. The second folder made my stomach clench. Meeting minutes, creative development sessions, 1995 to 2015. I'd started keeping detailed notes of our brainstorming sessions after Julian began taking full credit for collaborative ideas. 20 years of documentation proving that our most successful show concepts originated from my research, my interviews, my understanding of what audiences actually wanted to hear. One particular set of notes made me pause. September 2003. Morning Conversations was struggling with ratings among younger demographics. The network threatened cancellation unless we could prove relevance with viewers under 40. I'd spent 2 weeks interviewing college students, young mothers, entry-level professionals. Their feedback was consistent. They wanted honest conversations about real problems, not celebrity gossip and lifestyle segments. I'd proposed Real Talk Tuesdays, episodes focusing on student debt, workplace harassment, affordable healthcare, relationship challenges. Julian had initially dismissed the idea as too depressing for morning television, but the format became our highest-rated segment, eventually spinning off into a standalone show that ran for 8 years. In media profiles. Afterward, Julian described Real Talk Tuesdays as his breakthrough concept. I realized younger audiences craved authenticity, he told Chicago Magazine in 2005. They were tired of superficial morning show content. I wanted to create something that spoke to their real experiences. I wanted his breakthrough, his concept. Reading my own notes from that time period, I could see how systematically Julian had erased my contributions. In early meetings, the ideas were collaborative. Maury suggests focusing on financial stress. Julian likes the authenticity angle. We decide to test with younger focus groups. But as the segment gained success, the language in meeting minutes shifted. Julian's concept for Real Talk, Julian's vision for authentic content, Julian's innovative approach to morning television. I'd been the one writing those minutes. I'd documented my own erasure in real time, to focus on the work to notice how my pronouns were disappearing. The third folder contained financial records that told a different story than Julian's public narrative. Becker Ortiz Productions hadn't just been successful, it had been extraordinarily profitable, generating revenues that Julian consistently understated in divorce proceedings. His claim that the company was struggling to adapt to modern markets was contradicted by bank statements showing steady growth through 2022. More damaging were the expense reports. Julian had been using company funds for personal expenses, luxury vacations disguised as research trips, expensive dinners with no business purpose, a company car that he drove exclusively for personal use. The total exceeded $200,000 over 5 years, money that should have been shared between partners. But the fourth folder contained the evidence that could destroy him completely: employment and workplace issues. Sexual harassment complaints filed against Julian by 3 different female employees between 2018 and 2021. Each complaint had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements and severance packages. Julian had portrayed these departures as natural turnover, but internal memos showed a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward younger women. I discovered these files by accident when cleaning out company digital storage. Julian had asked me to archive old documents, but hadn't bothered to review what I might find. The sexual harassment complaints weren't just morally damaging, they represented legal liability that could expose him to criminal charges if the women decided to speak publicly. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother Tony. Saw the podcast clip. That bastard finally showed his true colors. You okay? I typed back. I'm better than okay. I'm ready. Ready for what? I stared at the boxes of evidence surrounding me, to remind him why he should never underestimate a woman who knows where all the bodies are buried. Tony called immediately. Maury, what are you planning? I don't know yet. But he made a mistake talking about me publicly. He opened the door. Be careful, sis. Guys like Julian have lawyers and connections. They know how to make problems disappear. He made me disappear, I said. But I'm still here. And I have 37 years of his secrets. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and started researching media outlets that might be interested in Julian's story. Traditional journalism seemed unlikely. Julian still had relationships with entertainment reporters, and most stories about television industry disputes were boring to general audiences. I needed something with more immediate impact. That's when I remembered Simone Dorsey. Simone hosted Truth and Tea, a daytime talk show that had gained massive social media following over the past 2 years. Unlike traditional talk shows, Simone, specialized in exposing powerful people who'd hurt others. Her format was simple: invite someone with a story to tell, let them present their evidence, then bring in the accused person for a live confrontation. The show was controversial, but effective. Simone had exposed predatory talent agents, corrupt politicians, abusive executives. Her audiences were predominantly women, often women who'd been dismissed or discredited by powerful men. The show's tagline was "Where truth gets its day in court." More importantly, Simone was young, black, and from Chicago's South Side. She understood what it meant to be underestimated by men who thought their status made them untouchable. She also understood how to create viral television moments that couldn't be buried or spun. I'd actually met Simone briefly in 2019 at a Chicago media event. She'd approached me with genuine enthusiasm, saying she'd grown up watching morning conversations and citing it as inspiration for her own career. "You taught me that television could be both entertaining and meaningful," she'd said. "Thank you for that." At the time, I'd been flattered, but focused on my own problems. Now, I realized Simone might be exactly the ally I needed. I found her production company's website and spent an hour reading about recent shows. Simone didn't just embarrass her targets, she gave victims a platform to reclaim their narratives. Women who'd been silenced by NDAs, employees who'd been blacklisted for speaking truth, whistleblowers who'd been ignored by traditional media. The application process was surprisingly straightforward, a simple form asking for basic information about the situation, evidence of wrongdoing, and willingness to participate in a live television confrontation. They requested documentation but didn't require legal representation or extensive pre-screening. I filled out the form methodically, summarizing Julian's financial fraud, creative theft, and workplace misconduct. In the evidence section, I listed dozens of documents, recordings, and financial records. For the question, "What outcome are you seeking?" I wrote, "I want Julian Becker to publicly acknowledge his lies and apologize for destroying my career and reputation." But as I prepared to submit the application, I hesitated. Once I sent this, there would be no going back. Julian would be forced to respond, probably with expensive lawyers and aggressive counterattacks. My comfortable, quiet retirement would become a very public war. I thought about my mother, who died 5 years earlier without ever seeing me receive proper credit for my work. I thought about young women in television who were probably experiencing the same dismissal and erasure I'd endured. I thought about Julian's casual cruelty on that podcast, reducing my life's work to dead weight. Then I hit submit. The auto-reply email promised a response within 48 hours. I closed my laptop and looked around at the evidence scattered across my kitchen table. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Julian had spent decades controlling the narrative about our partnership. He'd used his charm, his connections, and his willingness to rewrite history to position himself as the creative genius and me as the helpful assistant. But television was a two-way medium. It required both storyteller and audience, both performance and truth. Julian was about to learn that some stories can't be controlled, especially when the person with the receipts finally decides to speak. I started organizing the evidence into presentation folders, thinking about how to tell my story in a way that would be both compelling and devastating. Julian had taught me everything I knew about television production. He'd just forgotten that I'd been paying attention. My phone rang. "Unknown number, Ms. Ortiz. This is Simone Dorsey. I just read your application, and honey, we need to talk." Simone's voice was exactly as I remember from our brief meeting 4 years earlier, warm but commanding, with an edge that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk. "Ms. Ortiz, I have to be honest with you. When I saw your name in our submissions this morning, I literally screamed. My producer thought something was wrong. I laughed despite my nervousness. I hope that's a good thing. It's a very good thing. Look, I need you to know something. When I was 12 years old, I used to wake up early just to watch morning conversations. You and Julian were appointment television in my house. My grandmother would make coffee, and we'd sit together watching you interview people who looked like us, talking about issues that mattered to working families. That means more to me than you know, I said, settling into my kitchen chair with the phone pressed to my ear. But here's what really stuck with me, Simone continued, even as a kid, I could tell you were the heart of that show. Julian was smooth, but you asked the questions that made people cry, made them laugh, made them feel seen. You had this way of finding the humanity in every story. I felt tears threatening and cleared my throat. I tried to honor people's experiences. You did more than that. You created space for voices that didn't usually get heard on television. And Julian Becker has been taking credit for your work for decades. Now he's out here calling you dead weight on a podcast. Baby, we're about to give him a reality check he'll never forget. The certainty in her voice was intoxicating. For 3 years, I'd been swimming in legal documents and financial records, trying to prove my worth to lawyers who saw my situation as just another contentious divorce. Simone saw something different, a story worth telling, a wrong worth righting. What did you have in mind? I asked. First, I need to see everything. All the documentation you mentioned in your application. My team will review it and figure out how to present it most effectively. Then we'll schedule a pre-interview to discuss your comfort level with different approaches. Well, we could do a straightforward interview where you tell your story and present your evidence. That's powerful but relatively safe. Or ... she paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. We could invite Julian to appear on the show. My stomach dropped. You think he'd agree to that? Honey, men like Julian Becker can't resist defending themselves on television, especially when they think they're dealing with someone they can charm or intimidate. We'll frame it as an opportunity for him to set the record straight about the partnership. His ego won't let him stay away. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. In equal measure, what if he brings lawyers? What if he tries to shut down the broadcast? That's the beauty of live television. Once we're on air, the story belongs to the audience. He can threaten lawsuits afterward, but he can't stop millions of people from hearing the truth. And based on what you've told me, you have enough evidence to back up every claim. I walked to my kitchen window and stared out at the lake. The water was calmer today, reflecting afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. Simone, I need to ask you something directly. Is this about justice for me, or is it about ratings for your show? Both, she said without hesitation. I won't lie to you, this will be massive for our ratings. Julian Becker is still a recognizable name, and workplace abuse stories are incredibly relevant right now. But that doesn't make your story less important. Actually, it makes it more important. We have a chance to reach millions of women who've experienced exactly what you've been through. Her honesty was refreshing. Julian had always presented his motivations as pure artistic vision, never admitting that success and profit were equally important to him. Simone's transparency felt like a foundation we could build on. What's the timeline? I asked. If your evidence checks out, we could tape within 2 weeks. I want to strike while Julian's podcast comments are still fresh in people's minds. Internet attention spans are short, but right now you have momentum. 2 weeks. My voice came out higher than intended. I know it sounds fast, but timing is crucial for something like this. Julian will probably try to control the narrative once he realizes you're fighting back. We need to get your story out there before he can launch a preemptive defense. I thought about the boxes of evidence sitting on my kitchen table, the years of careful documentation, the decades of swallowed pride and stolen credit. What do you need from me? Everything? Financial records, contracts, correspondence, meeting notes. Also, I want you to think about specific moments where Julian took credit for your work. We need concrete examples with dates and witnesses if possible. I have all of that. Perfect. Can you bring everything to our studio tomorrow? I want my research team to start building a timeline. I agreed to meet her the following afternoon, and we exchanged contact information. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd just jumped off a cliff. There was no turning back now. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from listening to Julian trash my reputation on a podcast to planning a live television confrontation. My phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed my niece Eleanor's name, Tia Murray. I just saw the most insane thing on TikTok. Some girl posted a clip of Uncle Julian calling you dead weight on a podcast. Tell me that's not real. Ailana was Tony's daughter, 26 years old, and working as a social media manager for a non-profit. She'd always been protective of me, especially after the divorce. It's real, I said. But I'm handling it. Handling it how? Tia, people are already making memes about this. Someone created a hashtag #deadweightmurray. This is going viral. My stomach clenched. I hadn't considered how quickly Julian's comments might spread beyond the podcast's original audience. What kind of memes? Some of them are actually supportive. Women sharing their own stories about being dismissed by male colleagues. But some are just cruel. You know how the internet can be. I did know. Social media had the power to destroy reputations overnight, but it could also amplify voices that had been silenced. The question was which direction my story would take. Ailana, can you do me a favor? Can you monitor what people are saying online? I need to understand how this is playing out in real time, of course. But Tia, what are you planning? Dad said. You sounded like you were preparing for war. Not war, I said. Justice. There's a difference, is there? Because sometimes they look pretty similar. After Ailana hung up, I walked back to my evidence boxes and started photographing documents with my phone. Each page represented hours of work, years of contribution, decades of partnership that Julian had reduced to a dismissive comment on a podcast. But as I worked, I realized something had shifted inside me. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't just defending myself or trying to prove my worth to skeptical lawyers. I was preparing to reclaim my story. Julian had forgotten that television was my medium too. He'd forgotten that I understood audiences, that I knew how to craft narratives that resonated with real people. Most importantly, he'd forgotten that truth has a power that charm and manipulation can't overcome. I spent the evening organizing evidence into categories, thinking about how to present each piece for maximum impact. By midnight, I had everything sorted into presentation folders with clear labels and supporting documentation. The story was ready to be told. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked older than I felt, but there was something different in my eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. I looked like a woman who was done being underestimated. Tomorrow, I would walk into Simone's studio with 3 years of evidence and 37 years of experience. Julian thought he discarded me like dead weight, but he was about to learn that some things get more dangerous when you throw them away. Some things get ready to fight back. The truth, NT production offices occupied to floors of a converted warehouse in Chicago's West Loop, all exposed brick, and industrial lighting that somehow managed to feel both edgy and welcoming. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the most damaging evidence against Julian. The rest was digitized on my laptop and backed up in cloud storage that even I couldn't accidentally delete. Simone met me in the lobby personally, which surprised me. Television executives usually sent assistants to handle preliminary meetings. But Simone wasn't typical television anything. She wore jeans and a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and she moved with the confident energy of someone who'd built her own kingdom. Ms. Ortiz, you look exactly like you did when I was 12, she said, shaking my hand warmly. Elegant and ready for business? Please, call me Maribel. And thank you for seeing me so quickly. Are you kidding? This is the most excited I've been about a story in months. Come on, let me show you around. She led me through the main production floor, where young staffers hunch over computers editing footage and researching upcoming guests. The energy reminded me of newsrooms from my early career, focused intensity mixed with barely contained chaos. But the demographic was completely different. Most of the staff appeared to be under 30, and the racial and ethnic diversity would have been unimaginable in 1980s television. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This is what the industry looks like when women and people of color actually get to build something, Simone said, noticing my attention. Half our staff are former interns or entry-level employees who got tired of being ignored at traditional networks. We settled in her office, which featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. On her desk sat a framed photo of herself with Oprah Winfrey, both women smiling at some industry event. Behind her chair hung several awards, including a Peabody for a series exposing corruption in Chicago city government. So, Simone said, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee. Tell me about the Emmy. I blinked. Which Emmy? The one Julian Becker won in 2001 for Outstanding Talk Show Host. I've been doing research since yesterday, and there's something interesting about that award. My chest tightened. The 2001 Emmy was a sore subject I'd tried to forget. What did you find? The nomination paperwork lists Julian as the sole creative force behind Morning Conversations. But I tracked down the original submission materials, and there's a problem with the timeline. Half the episodes he claimed credit for aired before. He was even hired as host. I laughed a bit early. You want to know the real story behind that Emmy? I absolutely do. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a folder I'd labeled awards and recognition. Inside were photocopies of the original Emmy submission materials, which I'd saved because I'd been the one to complete them. Julian didn't submit his own nomination. I said, I did. He was traveling that week, so he asked me to handle the paperwork. The submission required detailed creative contributions for each nominated episode, including concept development, research, writing, and production oversight. Simone leaned forward. What did you put down? The truth. That episodes were collaboratively created, with Julian handling on-camera hosting and me managing everything else. But when the nomination was announced, Julian's publicity team rewrote the narrative. Suddenly, he was the sole creative visionary. Do you have proof of this? I handed her a copy of the original submission form, with my handwriting clearly visible in the creative contribution section. This is the form I filled out and submitted. You can compare it to what the Television Academy has on file now. Simone studied the document, occasionally making notes. Maribel, this is fraud. He literally stole credit for your work in an official industry document. It gets worse, I said. Julian never told me he'd changed the submission materials. I found out 6 months later when a journalist called me for a feature story about the Emmy win. She asked about my supporting role in Julian's creative process. That's when I realized what had happened. What did you do? Nothing. What could I do? The award had already been given. Julian was riding high on industry recognition, correcting. The record would have looked petty and vindictive. I convinced myself it didn't matter as long as our partnership was strong. But your partnership wasn't strong. I shook my head. I just didn't want to admit it yet. The Emmy theft was the beginning of a pattern, but I kept making excuses. I told myself Julian was under pressure, that success was going to his head, that things would get better once we established clearer boundaries. Simone flipped through more documents in my portfolio. What's this contract from 2003? Syndication deal for international distribution. Julian negotiated it personally, which was unusual. Normally, we handled major contracts together, and he structured it so that creative royalties went exclusively to him as original creator and primary host. I was listed as a producer, which meant I got a smaller percentage despite having developed most of the content. Did you object? I tried. Julian said it was temporary, just for the international markets. He promised we'd renegotiate once the syndication proved successful. That renegotiation never happened. Simone was taking detailed notes now, occasionally, asking for clarification on dates and financial details. After an hour, she leaned back in her chair with the expression I couldn't quite read. Maribel, I have to ask you something difficult. Why didn't you fight this earlier? You had evidence. A fraud, breach of contract, intellectual property theft. Why wait until now? The question I'd been dreading. Because I loved him, because I believed in our partnership. Because fighting would have meant admitting that the most important relationship in my life was built on lies. And now I'm 61 years old with nothing to show for 40 years in television except an apartment I can barely afford and a reputation as Julian Becker's helpful ex-wife. I don't have time to be polite anymore, Simone smiled. Good. Politeness is overrated, especially when you're dealing with someone who's been systematically stealing from you for decades. She called in her senior producer, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica, who immediately started asking tactical questions about witness availability, document authentication, and legal exposure. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, people who understood how to build bulletproof cases that could withstand aggressive counterattacks. We'll need to verify everything independently, Jessica explained. Julian's team will challenge any evidence that can't be corroborated through official sources. Do you have contact information for former employees who might be willing to speak on record? I provided names and phone numbers for 3 former staff members who'd witnessed Julian's pattern of taking credit for collaborative work. 2 of them had left the company specifically because they were tired of his behavior, and 1 had actually congratulated me privately when she heard about our divorce. What about the sexual harassment complaints? Simone asked. Those are trickier. The women signed NDAs as part of their settlements. They can't speak publicly without risking lawsuits. We don't need them to speak, Jessica said. We just need to reference the existence of the complaints and the settlement payments. That's public record through the company's financial filings. By mid-afternoon, we'd outlined a comprehensive strategy for my television appearance. The show would begin with my story, 30 minutes of uninterrupted time to present evidence and explain Julian's pattern of abuse. Then they'd bring Julian on for what he'd think was an opportunity to defend himself. He won't know what's coming, Simone explained. We'll invite him to address rumors and misunderstandings about your partnership. His ego won't let him refuse, especially not on live television. What if he brings lawyers? He can bring a whole firm if he wants. This is live TV, not a courtroom. The audience will see everything, his evidence, your evidence, and how each of you handles the pressure. As we prepared to wrap up the meeting, Simone handed me a contract for my appearance. The terms were straightforward. I'd tell my story without censorship. They'd provide legal support if Julian tried to sue afterward, and I'd receive a modest appearance fee that would at least cover my rent for a few months. There's one more thing, Simone said. I want you to think about what you really want to accomplish with this. Revenge is satisfying, but it's temporary. What would make this worthwhile for you in the long term? I considered the question as, I gathered my documents. What did I want? Julian's public humiliation, his professional destruction. Financial compensation for decades of stolen credit. I want young women in television to see what happens when someone finally fights back. I said, I want them to know they don't have to smile and stay quiet when powerful men steal their work. And I want Julian to understand that some bridges burn both ways. Simone nodded approvingly. Now that's a story worth telling. As I left the studio, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded me of my first live television broadcast. 40 years earlier, the stakes were different now. Instead of launching a career, I was potentially ending one. But the fundamental challenge was the same. Tell the truth clearly enough that people will listen, compellingly enough that they'll care. Julian had taught me everything I knew about television performance. Tomorrow, I'd use those lessons to destroy him. The call came 3 days later while I was reviewing my notes for the television appearance. Julian's name appeared on my phone screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. We hadn't spoken directly since the divorce was finalized 2 years earlier. But curiosity won out. Hello, Julian. Maury. His voice had that forced casualness he used when he was trying to manipulate someone. I hope you're doing well. I heard through the grapevine that you might be planning some kind of media appearance. Did you now? I kept my tone neutral, though my heart was racing. Someone in Simone's production company had obviously leaked information, which meant Julian was already preparing his defense. Look, I know things ended badly between us, and I take responsibility for that. But Maury, we built something beautiful together. Do we really want to destroy that legacy with public fighting? The audacity was breathtaking. You destroyed it when you called me dead weight on a podcast, Julian. You destroyed it when you stole credit for my work. You destroyed it when you pushed me out of the company we built together. That's not how I see it. And you know that's not how it really happened. But forget about the past for a minute. Let's talk about the future. What would it take to resolve this privately? And there it was, the offer I'd been expecting. Julian wasn't calling to apologize or admit wrongdoing. He was calling to buy my silence. What did you have in mind? I asked, genuinely curious about how much he thought my dignity was worth. I've been thinking about establishing a scholarship fund. The Julian and Maribel Becker Creative Excellence Scholarship for Women in Television. Full funding for graduate school, plus internship opportunities. We could announce it together, show the industry that we're still partners in supporting the next generation. It was a clever offer, financially meaningful, publicly gracious, and completely under his control. The scholarship would bear both our names, but Julian would run it through his production company. I'd get recognition for being generous and forward-thinking, while he'd get credit for being magnanimous to his ex-partner. How much money are we talking about? I asked. $500,000 over 10 years, full rides for 5 exceptional women. Think about the impact. Maury, think about the legacy. Legacy. His favorite word when he wanted to manipulate my emotions. But $500,000 was real money, more than I'd see from a television appearance or any potential lawsuit. It would solve my immediate financial problems and provide security for the rest of my life. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course. But Murray, I should mention that my lawyers are concerned about some of the claims being made. If there's going to be a public dispute, they'll need to respond aggressively. For both our sakes, it would be better to resolve this privately. There was the threat, delivered with typical Julian subtlety. Accept the scholarship offer, or face an expensive legal battle I couldn't afford to win. I'll call you back in 24 hours, I said, and hung up before he could respond. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the phone and feeling the familiar weight of Julian's manipulation. He'd spent decades using this exact approach, offering just enough to make resistance seem unreasonable, while making the consequences of fighting sound catastrophic. How many times had I accepted his version of compromise rather than push for what I actually deserved? But this time felt different. This time I had evidence, allies, and a platform that Julian couldn't control. Most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. My phone rang again. Alana, Tia, I've been monitoring social media like you asked. The conversation is getting weird. Weird how? Someone leaked that you're going to be on Truth and T. People are speculating about what you're going to reveal. There are rumors about financial fraud, sexual harassment, criminal activity. It's getting really intense. That's not necessarily bad. Controversy drives viewership, maybe, but Uncle Julian's team is pushing back hard. They're posting old clips of you praising him, trying to make you look hypocritical. And they're spreading a story that you're doing this because you're broke and bitter after the divorce. Of course they were. Julian's public relations strategy had always been to attack the messenger when he couldn't dispute the message. If I appeared desperate or vindictive, audiences would be less likely to believe my accusations. What else are they saying? That you're having some kind of mental health crisis. That losing the business sent you into a spiral and now you're making false accusations for attention. It's disgusting, but it's probably effective with people who don't know the real story. The mental health angle was particularly insidious because it was impossible to disprove and played into stereotypes about emotional women making irrational decisions. Julian had learned from watching other powerful men discredit their accusers. Alana, I need you to do something for me. I need you to record a conversation I'm going to have with Julian tomorrow. Tia, that might be illegal without his consent. Illinois is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows about the recording, it's legal. Look it up. I explained my plan. I'd call Julian back and accept his scholarship offer. But I'd push for details about how he wanted to structure the announcement. If I could get him to admit on tape that the offer was contingent on my silence about his misconduct, it would prove that he was trying to buy my cooperation. But what if he doesn't say anything incriminating? Alana asked. Then I'll push harder. Julian's arrogant when he thinks he's winning. He won't be able to resist explaining how clever his strategy is. That evening, I called Simone to discuss the scholarship offer. She listened to my explanation without interrupting, occasionally asking questions about specific terms and timeline. It's a good offer, she said finally. Financially, you'd be better off taking the money. But Maribel, once you take that scholarship deal, your story ends. You become the grateful ex-partner who Julian generously supported after their amicable separation. The truth about what really happened disappears forever, I know. But $500,000 is life-changing money for someone in my situation. It is. And I want you to think very carefully about what you're willing to sacrifice for justice. Because that's what we're talking about here, justice versus financial security. There's no guarantee that appearing on my show will lead to either money or satisfaction. Her honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Simone wasn't promising me a fairy tale ending where truth triumphant and the villain got everything he deserved. She was offering me a chance to speak, nothing more. What would you do? I asked. I can't answer that, but I can tell you that some of the most powerful moments in television happen when someone decides that being heard is more important than being safe. After hanging up with Simone, I spent hours walking around my apartment, weighing my options. The scholarship offer represented everything I'd lost: financial security, professional recognition, a legacy that extended beyond my relationship with Julian. Taking it would mean admitting that my 37 years of work were worth exactly what Julian decided to pay for my silence. But rejecting it meant gambling everything on a single television appearance. If my story didn't resonate with audiences, if Julian successfully painted me as a bitter ex-wife, if the evidence wasn't compelling enough to change public opinion, I'd be left with nothing except the satisfaction of having spoken truth to Power. At midnight, I made my decision. I set up my phone to record the conversation, then called Julian. "Mari, I'm so glad you called. Have you thought about the scholarship?" "I have. It's a generous offer, Julian. More generous than I expected. I want this to work for both of us. We accomplished too much together to let it end with public fighting. I agree. But I have some questions about the structure. Would this scholarship be completely separate from any media appearances I might make?" "Well, obviously we'd want to coordinate our messaging. It wouldn't make sense to announce a partnership while you're making accusations on television. So, the scholarship depends on me staying quiet about our business relationship. I wouldn't put it that way. I'd say the scholarship depends on us presenting a united front about our shared commitment to supporting young women. And if I went ahead with the television appearance." There was a long pause. "Mari, my lawyers have been very clear about this. If you make false statements about me or the company on television, they'll respond with everything they have. That includes questioning your mental state, your motivations, your financial desperation. It would get very ugly very quickly. Are you threatening me, Julian? I'm offering you a way forward that benefits everyone. But if you choose to make this a public fight, I'll protect myself and my reputation. You understand business, Mari? You know how this works. I had everything I needed." Julian had just admitted on tape that the scholarship offer was conditional on my silence, and he'd threatened retaliation if I spoke publicly. It wasn't smoking gun evidence, but it established his consciousness of guilt and his willingness to use intimidation. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," I said, and hung up. I immediately sent the recording to Alana and to Simone's production team. Within an hour, Simone called back. "Maribel, this recording changes everything. Julian just proved that he's trying to buy your silence and threatening you if you refuse. We can use this." "How?" "We'll play it during your appearance. Let the audience hear exactly how he operates when he thinks no one's listening. This isn't just about your story anymore, it's about how powerful men silence women who threaten their narratives. For the first time since this started, I felt truly confident about my decision." Julian had revealed himself completely, and he'd done it in his own words. Tomorrow, I'd call him back and reject his offer. Then I'd go on live television and show the world who Julian Becker really was when he couldn't charm his way out of accountability. The war was about to begin, and I finally had the weapons to win it. The morning of the show, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my stomach twisted in knots. In 3 hours, I would walk into a television studio and attempt to destroy the professional reputation of the man I'd once loved, the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd systematically erased my contributions to our shared success. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the final script Simone's team had prepared. 28 pages of carefully orchestrated revelation, starting with my personal story and building to the recording of Julian's attempted bribery. Every claim was supported by documentation, every accusation backed by evidence that Julian's lawyers couldn't easily dispute. The show's format was deceptively simple. Simone would introduce me as a television industry veteran with an explosive story about betrayal and justice. I'd have 30 minutes to present my case without interruption, using a combination of documents, audio recordings, and personal testimony. Then they'd bring Julian on via satellite link for what he believed was a chance to address misunderstandings about his business practices. Julian had agreed to appear after his publicity team received a carefully worded invitation that made the show sound like a public relations opportunity. A chance to set the record straight, they'd called it. Julian's ego wouldn't let him resist the opportunity to defend himself on live television, especially against someone he dismissed as dead weight. What Julian didn't know was that Simone planned to confront him with evidence in real time, playing the bribery recording and presenting documents he'd never seen before. By the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late to walk away without looking guilty. My phone buzzed with a text from Tony. Proud of you, sis. Mum would be too. Give 'em hell. Alana had been sending me social media updates all morning. #deadweight Murray was trending again, but the conversation had shifted. Instead of marking Julian's dismissive comment, people were sharing their own stories of workplace betrayal and gender discrimination. The hashtag had evolved from mockery to solidarity. Women are posting screenshots of emails where male colleagues took credit for their work. Elena texted. Someone created a thread called Things Men Called Me When I Demanded Credit. This is bigger than just your story now. At 8 a.m., a car arrived to take me to the studio. The driver was a young black woman who recognized me immediately, Miss Ortiz. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. My grandmother watched your show religiously. She always said you were the real talent, that Julian was just the pretty face. Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. She was. She died last year, but she would have loved seeing you fight back. She always said women like you pave the way for women like me. The comment stayed with me during the 20-minute drive to the studio. I wasn't just fighting for my own reputation anymore. I was fighting for every woman who'd been dismissed, discredited, or forgotten by men who'd built careers on their contributions. At the studio, Simone met me in the green room with coffee and final instructions. She'd arranged for a makeup artist to make me look polished, but not overly glamorous, which in television terms meant credible witness, not desperate attention seeker. How are you feeling? She asked as the makeup artist worked, terrified, excited, ready. I paused. Simone, what if this backfires? What if Julian comes across as sympathetic and I look vindictive? That's not going to happen. We've tested the strongest pieces of evidence with focus groups. Your story is compelling, your documentation is solid, and Julian's own words condemn him. Trust the process. At 9:30, a production assistant walked me to the set. The studio was smaller than I'd expected, designed to feel intimate rather than theatrical. 2 chairs faced each other across a small table, with cameras positioned to capture natural conversation rather than formal interviews. Simone emerged from behind the cameras wearing a sharp blue dress that would look perfect on television. She moved with the comfort and energy I remembered from successful hosts present and engaged, but not overwhelming. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll live in 60 seconds, the floor manager announced. I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was here, not for revenge, though revenge would be satisfying. Not for money, though money would be helpful. I was here because someone needed to say that Julian Becker had built his success on stolen foundations, and that someone might as well be the woman who'd laid those foundations in the first place. 5, 4, 3, to ... The floor manager pointed at Simone. Good morning, and welcome to Truth and Tea. I'm Simone Dorsey, and today we have a story that's going to shock you. It's about power, betrayal, and what happens when a woman finally decides to fight back after decades of silence. Simone's introduction was perfect, compelling without being sensational, serious without being preachy. She outlined my background in television and my partnership with Julian, then explained how recent events had prompted me to speak publicly for the first time. With me today is Maribel Ortiz, a woman who helped build one of Chicago's most successful media companies, only to watch her partner systematically erase her contributions. Maribel, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Simone, let's start at the beginning. How did you meet Julian Becker? I told the story chronologically, starting with our meeting at WGN in 1986 and building through our early successes, marriage, and eventual empire. Simone asked clarifying questions that allowed me to present evidence naturally. The original partnership agreement, examples of stolen creative credit, financial records showing Julian's misconduct. The studio monitors showed audience engagement, numbers climbing steadily. Social media mentions were exploding. People were paying attention. 20 minutes into my segment, Simone introduced the recording of Julian's bribery attempt. Maribel, you received a phone call from Julian 3 days ago. Tell us about that conversation. I explained the scholarship offer and its implicit conditions. Then Simone played the full recording. Julian's voice filled the studio, casual and confident as he outlined his strategy for buying my silence and threatening retaliation if I refused. The impact was immediate. I could see crew members looking shocked, even though they'd heard the recording during rehearsal. On television, hearing Julian's actual voice made his manipulation feel more real, more personal. After hearing that recording, Simone said, "What went through your mind?" That he still thinks he can control the narrative. That he still believes his reputation is more important than the truth. And that he's forgotten something crucial about television: it only works when the audience trusts what they're seeing. At the 30-minute mark, Simone transitioned seamlessly. When we come back, we'll be joined by Julian Becker himself, who's agreed to address these allegations. Stay with us. During the commercial break, Simone squeezed my hand. You were perfect, calm, credible, devastating. Now comes the fun part. A production assistant was setting up the satellite connection that would bring Julian on air from his office in Lincoln Park. I could see him on the monitor, adjusting his tie and checking his hair. He looked confident, almost amused. He had no idea what was coming. Back in 30 seconds, the floor manager called. I straightened in my chair and prepared for the confrontation I'd been anticipating for 3 years. Julian thought he was coming on television to charm his way out of trouble, to spin my accusations into the complaints of a bitter ex-wife. He was about to learn that some women get more dangerous when you underestimate them. The floor manager counted down again. 5, 4, 3, 2. Welcome back to Truth and Tea. We're now joined by Julian Becker, the man at the center of these allegations. Julian, thank you for joining us. Julian's smile was pure television professional, warm but not overly familiar, confident but not arrogant. Thank you for having me, Simone. I appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight. Let's get right to it. Maribel has presented some serious accusations about your business partnership. She's claiming you systematically stole credit for her work over several decades. How do you respond? Well, Simone, I think anyone who's been through a difficult divorce understands that perspectives can become distorted. Maribel was absolutely crucial to our early success, and I've never claimed otherwise. But creative collaboration is complex. Ideas build on other ideas. What Maribel is presenting as theft, I see as the natural evolution of a creative partnership. It was a good answer, acknowledging my contributions while minimizing them, positioning the dispute as typical post-divorce bitterness rather than systematic fraud. Julian hadn't lost his media skills. Julian, Simone said, let me play something for you. She cued the recording of our phone conversation. Julian's face went through a remarkable transformation as he heard his own voice offering the scholarship in exchange for my silence and threatening legal retaliation if I refused. Julian, that's your voice, correct? Yes. But you're offering Maribel money contingent on her staying quiet about your business practices. How is that not attempting to buy her silence? Julian's composure cracked slightly. That's taken completely out of context. I was trying to find a constructive way forward that would benefit everyone, including the young women who would receive those scholarships, but you specifically said the scholarship depended on Maribel not making television appearances. Your exact words were that it wouldn't make sense to announce a partnership while she was making accusations. How is that not conditional? I was trying to avoid exactly this kind of public confrontation, which helps no one. Simone smiled, and I recognized the expression from my research on her previous shows. It was the look of a predator who just cornered her prey. Julian, let me show you something else. She held up a copy of the original Emmy submission form, the one I'd filled out in 2001. This is the paperwork Maribel submitted for your Emmy nomination. As you can see, it clearly describes collaborative creative contributions, but the final version on file with the Television Academy shows you as the sole creator. Can you explain how that happened? Julian's face went pale. He obviously hadn't expected Simone to have that specific document. There may have been revisions to clarify the specific nature of contributions ... revisions that removed all mention of Maribel's work and credited everything to you personally. The Emmy process requires clear delineation of roles, Julian. This is fraud. You submitted false information to the Television Academy to steal credit for work you didn't do. Do you have any response to that accusation? The confident media professional was gone. Julian looked exactly like what he was, a man caught lying on live television with no way to explain himself. I think this interview has gone far enough. He said, if you're going to ambush me with taken out of context documents of Julian, this is live television. If these documents are out of context, this is your chance to provide the context. America is watching. What's your side of the story? Julian stared at the camera for a long moment, apparently realizing that walking away would look like an admission of guilt, but staying would mean facing more evidence he couldn't refute. Maribel, he said finally, looking directly at me through the satellite connection, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how things ended. I'm sorry if you felt undervalued. I'm sorry for the podcast comments. Can we please resolve this privately? It was an apology, but not the apology I needed. He was sorry for how I felt, not for what he'd done. Sorry for getting caught, not for the decades of theft and manipulation. Julian, I said, my voice steady and clear, I don't want your apology. I want you to tell the truth. I want you to admit that you built your career on work I did and credit you stole. I want you to acknowledge that the Emmy belongs to both of us. I want you to take responsibility for pushing me out of the company we built together so you could control the narrative about our partnership. Julian's composure finally broke completely. You want to destroy me, don't you? You want to take everything I've worked for and burn it down because you can't accept that your time is over. My time was never allowed to begin, I said. You made sure of that. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Simone presenting more evidence, and Julian becoming increasingly defensive and angry. By the end, he looked exactly like what the audience needed to see, a powerful man who'd spent decades stealing from the woman who'd helped make him successful. When it was over, Julian disconnected from the satellite feed without saying goodbye. The studio was silent for a moment before Simone delivered her closing. Truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary. Thank you for watching Truth and Tea. I'm Simone Dorsey, and I'll see you tomorrow. As the cameras stopped rolling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete satisfaction. Not because I'd destroyed Julian, though I had. Not because I'd gotten revenge, though that felt wonderful. I felt satisfied because I'd finally told my story on my own terms, with my own voice, in my own words. For the first time in decades, I was more than Julian Becker's forgotten partner. I was Maribel Ortiz, and I just reminded the world who I really was. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour of the show ending, my phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, television producers, lawyers, and people I hadn't heard from in years. Aylana had been monitoring social media throughout the broadcast, sending me screenshots of the reaction in real time. "Tia, you have to see this," she texted, along with a video that had already been viewed 2 million times. It was a compilation of Julian's worst moments from the interview, his stumbling attempts to explain the Emmy fraud, his obvious discomfort when confronted with the bribery recording, his final angry outburst about my time being over, but more meaningful with the personal responses, women sharing their own stories of stolen credit and workplace dismissal. Young professionals posting about male colleagues who'd taken recognition for collaborative work, older women expressing gratitude for seeing someone their age fight back publicly. The hashtag had evolved again. #DeadWeightMaru was now being used by women posting photos of their professional accomplishments, with captions like "dead weight, according to my ex-boss," and "apparently dead weight gets Emmy nominations." Simon called, as I was trying to process the magnitude of the response. "Maribel, that was the most watched episode in our show's history. Our website crashed from traffic. We're getting interview requests from CNN. Good Morning America, 60 Minutes. How were you feeling?" "Overwhelmed," I admitted. "I knew this would get attention, but I didn't expect it to feel so big. It's big because your story resonated with something millions of women have experienced. You gave voice to a frustration that's been building for decades. This isn't just about you and Julian anymore, it's about systemic inequality in professional relationships." She was right. The interview had tapped into something larger than my personal grievances. Social media was filling with stories of women who'd been dismissed, discredited, or forgotten by male partners who'd taken credit for their contributions. I'd become an accidental symbol for anyone who'd ever been told their time was over when they were inconvenient to someone more powerful. My doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in her 30s holding a large bouquet of flowers. "Ms. Ortiz, I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News. Could we have a moment of your time?" I cracked the door open. "I'm not giving interviews right now, I understand. I just wanted to deliver these flowers and tell you something personally. My mother is a nurse who worked her way up to head of pediatric surgery at Northwestern. Last year, the hospital brought in a new chief of staff who systematically marginalized all the senior women doctors. My mother was forced into early retirement after 30 years of service." She watched your interview this morning and cried. She said it was the first time she'd seen someone fight back successfully. I accepted the flowers and asked Sarah to thank her mother for me. But as I closed the door, I realized the responsibility that came with my sudden visibility. I wasn't just Maribel Ortiz anymore. I was a symbol of resistance for women who'd been silenced by powerful men. Tony arrived an hour later with takeout from our favorite Puerto Rican restaurant. "I'm proud of you, Maury," he said, setting plates of alcaparras and pasteles on my kitchen table. "But are you ready for what comes next?" "What do you mean?" "Julian's not going to take this lying down. He's got lawyers, connections, money. Men like him don't just accept defeat, they fight back dirty." As if on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my former divorce attorney, Patricia Valdez. "Maribel, I just watched your interview. Brilliant television, but we need to talk immediately. Julian's legal team has already filed for an emergency restraining order claiming you violated your divorce agreement's non-disparagement clause." My stomach dropped. "What non-disparagement clause?" "Page 47 of your settlement agreement. It prohibits both parties from making public statements that could damage the other's professional reputation." I fought against including it, but Julian's team insisted. And frankly, we needed to close the deal. I pulled out my copy of the divorce settlement and found the relevant section. The language was broad enough to cover almost any public criticism, which meant Julian could potentially sue for damages based on my television appearance. "How serious is this?" I asked Patricia. "Very serious. Julian could claim that your interview cost him business opportunities, damaged his reputation, interfered with existing contracts. The financial exposure could be substantial, but everything I said was true. I have documentation for every claim. Truth is a defense against defamation, but it's not a defense against violating a contractual non-disparagement agreement. You agreed not to make public statements that could harm his reputation, regardless of whether those statements were accurate. I felt the familiar weight of Julian's manipulation settling over me. Even in divorce, he'd managed to structure agreements that protected him while leaving me vulnerable. The non-disparagement clause was his insurance policy, a way to ensure I'd never be able to challenge his narrative publicly. What are my options? We can fight the restraining order and argue that your statements were factual responses to his public attacks on your character, but that's expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. Alternatively, we could negotiate a settlement that resolves this quickly and quietly. There it was again, the pressure to stay quiet, to accept a private resolution rather than continue the public fight. Julian was using the legal system the same way he'd used the scholarship offer, as leverage to force my silence. Patricia, if I settle this, does that mean I can never speak publicly about our partnership again? Probably. Most settlement agreements would include broader non-disclosure provisions to prevent future disputes. I thanked Patricia and promised to call her back within 24 hours. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling the weight of the decision ahead of me. The television interview had been more successful than I'd imagined, but success had brought new pressures and new risks. Tony was watching me carefully. What did she say? I explained the legal situation and Patricia's recommendations. Tony listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as I outlined the potential consequences of continued fighting versus accepting a settlement. What does your gut tell you? He asked. That Julian is doing exactly what he's always done, using lawyers and contracts to control people when he can't charm them into compliance. He's betting that I'll be too scared of legal consequences too. Keep fighting. And are you too scared? I considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, I'd been a forgotten ex-partner with nothing to lose. Now I was a viral sensation with a platform that millions of women were watching. Speaking truth had given me more power than I'd possessed in years, but it had also made me a target for Julian's counter-attacks. My phone buzzed with a text from Ailana. Tia, you need to see this. Julian just posted on Instagram. I opened the app and found Julian's official account, which had gained 50,000 followers since this morning. His latest post was a carefully crafted statement accompanied by a professional headshot that made him look thoughtful and dignified. I've spent the last few hours reflecting on this morning's television program and the pain it has caused both Maribel and myself. While I disagree with many of the characterizations presented, I recognize that Maribel feels hurt by decisions made during our partnership and divorce. Rather than continue this public dispute, I'd like to extend an invitation for private mediation. That could result in mutual understanding and appropriate recognition of Maribel's contributions to our shared work. Some conversations are too important for television studios. The post had thousands of comments, mostly supportive of Julian's mature response to my attacks. He positioned himself as the reasonable party seeking private resolution, while implying that I was motivated by attention-seeking rather than justice. It was a masterful public relations move that reframed the narrative in his favor. Instead of addressing the specific evidence I'd presented, he'd focused on the process, suggesting that I should have handled this privately rather than embarrassing him on television. He's good at this, Tony observed, reading over my shoulder. He's had decades of practice, I replied. But as I read through the comments on Julian's post, I noticed something interesting. While many people were praising his willingness to mediate, others were pointing out that he'd never addressed the specific accusations. Several commenters linked to clips from my interview, and at least a dozen women had shared their own experiences with male colleagues who'd used similar tactics. The conversation was evolving beyond Julian's ability to control it, even his carefully crafted response was generating discussions about systemic workplace inequality rather than my supposed vindictiveness. Simone called again as evening approached. Maribel, I've been watching the social media response to Julian's statement. His team is good, but they're fighting the wrong war. This isn't about you versus Julian anymore. It's about a pattern of behavior that millions of women recognize. What? Do you mean Julian's trying to frame this as a personal dispute that should be resolved privately? But women are sharing stories about their own experiences with men who used identical tactics. His statement is actually proving your point about how powerful men avoid accountability. She was right. Julian's response followed a predictable script. Acknowledge hurt feelings without admitting wrongdoing, offer private resolution to avoid public scrutiny, position himself as the mature party while implying his accuser was emotional and unreasonable. I'm getting calls from other women who want to share their stories about Julian, Simone continued. Former employees, business partners, women who've dealt with similar behavior in television and other industries. Are you interested in doing a follow-up show? The opportunity was tempting but dangerous. A follow-up show would amplify the conversation and provide a platform for other women to speak truth. But it would also escalate my legal risks and make any private settlement with Julian impossible. Let me think about it, I said. That evening, I walked along Lake Michigan trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. The safe choice was to accept Julian's mediation offer, negotiate a settlement that provided some financial compensation and public recognition, then retreat back into private life. The riskier choice was to continue fighting publicly, using my platform to amplify other women's voices while facing potential legal and financial consequences. As I watched the sunset over the water, I thought about my mother cleaning houses for wealthy families while dreaming of better opportunities for her daughter. I thought about my grandmother, who'd raised 6 children while working in a factory and never complained about unfair treatment because she couldn't afford to make waves. I thought about all the women who'd been told to stay quiet, accept less than they deserved, prioritize peace over justice. Then I thought about Sarah Chen's mother, forced into early retirement after 30 years of dedicated service. I thought about the women commenting on social media, finally feeling permission to share stories they kept hidden for years. I thought about Aylana and her generation, who deserved to enter the workforce knowing that someone had fought for their right to be heard. By the time I returned to my apartment, I knew what I had to do. I called Patricia first. I'm not accepting any settlement that requires my silence. If Julian wants to sue me for telling the truth, let him try. At least the lawsuit will be public record. Then I called Simone. Let's do the follow-up show, and let's make sure every woman who wants to speak gets a chance to be heard. Finally, I called Aylana. I need you to help me with something. I want to create a social media campaign encouraging women to share their stories about workplace credit theft and gender discrimination. Can you help me figure out how to do that effectively? Of course, Tia. What do you want to call it? I thought for a moment about the phrase that had started this whole confrontation. Julian's dismissive comment that had revealed his true opinion of my worth. Let's call it dead weight rising, because apparently, when you throw away something valuable, sometimes it comes back stronger than before. The war wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time in my adult life, I was fighting on my own terms, with my own voice, for something larger than just my personal vindication. Julian had taught me everything I knew about television. Now I was going to use those lessons to create something he'd never imagined. a platform where women's voices couldn't be silenced by powerful men with good lawyers and better connections. Some weights, when dropped. Learn how to fly. 3 months later, I stood in the conference room of my new office space in the West Loop, looking out at Lake Michigan and marveling at how completely my life had changed. The Deadweight Rising campaign had evolved into a non-profit organization supporting women who'd been marginalized in male-dominated industries. We'd raised over $2 million from small donors across the country, funded legal assistance for 12 women pursuing workplace discrimination cases, and established a network of mentors and advocates spanning multiple industries. The office walls were covered with letters from women who'd found the courage to speak up after watching my interview with Simone. Photos from speaking events, newspaper clippings about our advocacy work, and thank you cards from women who'd received support during their own professional battles. Aylana walked in carrying coffee and a stack of morning newspapers. At 26, she'd become my right-hand person, managing social media strategy and coordinating with other advocacy organizations. The experience had transformed her from a non-profit social media manager into a skilled organizer and strategic thinker. How are you feeling about today? She asked, handing me a cup of coffee. Today was the day Julian's lawsuit against me would finally go to trial. After 3 months of legal maneuvering, depositions, and settlement conferences, we were heading to federal court to determine whether my television interview had violated the non-disparagement clause in my divorce agreement. Ready, I said. Which was mostly true. Whatever happens, we've already won the conversation that matters. The lawsuit had backfired spectacularly for Julian. Instead of silencing me, it had generated continuous media coverage of our dispute and the broader issues it represented. Every court filing became news. Every legal motion sparked fresh discussions about gender inequality in professional partnerships. More damaging for Julian, the lawsuit had prompted other women to come forward with their own stories about his behavior. 3 former employees had violated their NDAs to testify about sexual harassment and credit theft they'd witnessed or experienced. To business partners from earlier in his career had provided evidence of similar patterns of manipulation and betrayal. Julian's reputation was in ruins. Advertisers had pulled out of his shows, syndication deals had been cancelled, and his production company was hemorrhaging money from legal fees and lost revenue. The man who'd called me deadweight was discovering what actual deadweight felt like. Patricia arrived at 9 a.m. to escort me to the courthouse. She'd assembled a legal team that included specialists in First Amendment law, employment discrimination, and gender-based workplace harassment. What had started as a simple contract dispute had evolved into a test case about women's right to speak truth about powerful men who'd silenced them. The judge indicated yesterday that she's ready to rule on our motion for summary judgment. Patricia explained as we walked to her car. If she agrees that your statements were protected speech responding to Julian's public attacks, the case gets dismissed before trial. And if she doesn't agree, then we go to trial and let a jury decide whether your interview violated the divorce agreement. But honestly, Maribel, I think we're in good shape. Julian's team has struggled to prove actual damages, and our First Amendment arguments are strong. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters and protesters. Someone had organized a deadweight rising rally on the courthouse steps, with several dozen women holding signs that read "Truth isn't defamation" and "Women's voices matter." I recognized some faces from our advocacy events, women who'd become activists after finding their own courage to challenge workplace inequality. Inside the courthouse, Julian sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 expensive lawyers in matching suits. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. The stress of the last 3 months had aged him in ways that television makeup couldn't hide. Our eyes met briefly as I took my seat at the defendant's table. For a moment, I saw something. That might have been regret in his expression. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold determination I remembered from our worst fights during the divorce. Judge Rebecca Martinez called the court to order and immediately addressed the summary judgment motion. I've reviewed the pleadings and arguments from both sides. This case raises important questions about the balance between contractual obligations and First Amendment protections. She spoke for 20 minutes, outlining the legal principles that govern both contract enforcement and free speech protections. I tried to follow her reasoning, but my attention kept drifting to the gallery behind us, where I could see Tony, Aylana, and dozens of supporters who'd taken time off work to be here. However, Judge Martinez continued, I find that the plaintiff has failed to demonstrate that the defendant's statements were made with malicious intent or exceeded the scope of protected responsive speech. The defendant's television interview was a direct response to the plaintiff's public characterization of her professional contributions, and the evidence presented supports the factual accuracy of her claims. My heart started racing. It sounded like she was ruling in our favor, but I wanted to hear it explicitly before celebrating. Furthermore, the non-disparagement clause in question was overly broad and potentially unconstitutional as applied to truthful statements made in response to public attacks on the defendant's character and professional reputation. Accordingly, the defendant's motion for summary judgment is granted. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in applause from our supporters. Patricia squeezed my hand. Aylana was crying, and Tony was grinning so widely I could see him from across the room. Julian's legal team immediately requested a meeting with the judge to discuss appeal options. But the damage was done. I'd won completely. No financial liability, no restrictions on future speech, and a judicial ruling that my statements were protected truth-telling rather than contract violations. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with questions about my reaction to the victory and plans for future advocacy work. I'd learned over the past 3 months how to handle media attention in ways that serve my broader mission rather than just my personal satisfaction. This was never just about me and Julian, I said into the cluster of microphones. This was about whether powerful men can use legal contracts to silence women who challenge their narratives. Today's ruling establishes that truth is a defense not just against defamation, but against attempts to contractually restrict speech about workplace abuse. What's next for Dead Weight Rising? Asked a reporter from CNN, we're launching a legal defense fund to support other women facing similar retaliation for speaking truth about workplace inequality. We're also developing educational resources to help women understand their rights when confronting professional discrimination. Julian left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding reporters and protesters. I felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy. He'd lost everything he'd spent decades building. And unlike my losses, his were largely self-inflicted. But the sympathy passed quickly. Julian had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. He'd chosen to steal credit, silence criticism, and use legal intimidation to avoid accountability. Today's ruling was simply justice arriving 3 decades late. That evening, we held a celebration party at Tony's coffee shop. The small space was packed with supporters, advocates, and women who'd become friends during our fight. Aylana had created a slideshow of social media posts from the Dead Weight Rising community, hundreds of women sharing stories about finding their voices and challenging unfair treatment. Simone arrived with a bottle of champagne and a proposition. Maribel, I want to offer you something. How would you feel about hosting your own show? A weekly program focused on workplace justice and women's advocacy. The offer was tempting but surprising. I'm not sure I want to go back to television. Full-time, not full-time. Think of it as an extension of your advocacy work. A platform to elevate women's voices and hold powerful people accountable. You've already proven you can create compelling television that drives social change. I looked around the coffee shop at the women who'd become my community over the past 3 months. We'd built something powerful together, a network of support and advocacy that was changing lives and challenging systems. Television could amplify that work, but it could also distract from it. Let me think about it, I said. Right now, I want to focus on the women who need legal support and workplace advocacy. If television can serve that mission, then maybe, as the party wound down, I walked outside with Alana to get some air. The Chicago skyline was lit up against the night sky, and I found myself thinking about the young woman I'd been 40 years earlier, hungry and ambitious, and naive enough to believe that talent and hard work would be enough. Do you ever regret it? Alana asked. Everything that happened with Julian, the years of silence, waiting so long to fight back. I regret staying quiet as long as I did, I said. But I don't regret the fight itself. Everything that happened led to this moment, to this community we've built. Maybe I needed to be 61 before I was ready to stop caring about being polite. What would you tell your younger self? I thought about that 24-year-old woman starting her career in television, so eager to prove herself that she'd accept any partnership that offered opportunity. I'd tell her that her ideas were worth protecting, that collaboration doesn't mean erasure, that speaking up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. 6 months later, I did accept Simone's offer to host a weekly television show, but on my own terms. Voices Rising aired Sunday evenings and focused exclusively on workplace justice issues. We featured women fighting discrimination, exposed companies with patterns of gender bias, and provided resources for viewers facing similar challenges. The show won a Peabody Award in its first season, but more importantly, it generated concrete change. Companies featured on the show faced public pressure that led to policy reforms. Women who appeared as guests received job offers and business opportunities. Viewer donations funded legal assistance for dozens of discrimination cases. Julian's career never recovered. His production company closed within a year of my television interview, and he eventually moved to Phoenix to work for a small market station. He never apologized publicly for the decades of stolen credit, but he also never spoke about me again in interviews. I heard through industry contacts that he'd married his much younger fiancée, but the marriage lasted less than 2 years, apparently. She'd grown tired of being associated with his damaged reputation and had left him for a tech entrepreneur with a cleaner public image. On my 63rd birthday, I received an unexpected package with no return address. Inside was my Emmy statue, the one Julian had won in 2001 for work we'd done together. A note written in his handwriting simply said, "This belongs to both of us." I'm sorry it took me so long to admit that. I placed the Emmy on my office bookshelf, next to photos from dead weight rising events and thank you letters from women we'd helped. It felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence acknowledgement, finally, of what I'd always known to be true. Alana found me looking at the Emmy later that afternoon. How does it feel to finally get recognition, like it mattered more? When I didn't have it, I said honestly. The recognition I care about now comes from women who've found their voices, who've learned to fight for themselves, who've discovered that they don't have to stay silent when powerful men try to diminish them. That evening, Tony and I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. At 63, I was busier than I'd ever been, traveling constantly for speaking engagements and advocacy work. But I was also more content than I'd been since those early days in television when everything felt possible. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd fought back earlier? Tony asked, sometimes, but I think I needed to live through everything exactly as it happened to become the person who could build this movement. The young woman who married Julian wouldn't have had the experience or credibility to challenge systems the way we're doing now. So you think everything happens for a reason? I laughed. I think everything happens, and then we decide what the reasons are. Julian tried to erase me from our shared story, but that erasure taught me something valuable about the power of reclaiming your own narrative. As darkness fell over the city, I thought about all the women who were just beginning their careers, who would face the same choices I'd faced about when to speak up and when to stay quiet. Some of them would find their voices earlier than I did, some might take longer. But they'd have resources and role models that my generation had lacked. They'd know that dead weight, when it learns to fly, can rise higher than anyone imagined. They know that truth, when spoken with courage, can change everything. Most importantly, they know that their voices matter, their contributions count, and their stories deserve to be told on their own terms. Julian had taught me everything I knew about television, but life had taught me something more valuable, that the most important story you'll ever tell is your own, and no one else gets to decide how it ends. I was Maribel Ortiz. I'd built an empire, lost it, and built something better from the ashes. I'd learned that revenge is temporary, but justice creates change that lasts. And I was just getting started. 3 weeks after the courtroom victory that dismissed Julian Becker's lawsuit, Maribel Ortiz found herself alone in a quiet art gallery on Chicago's South Side. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with portraits of women in media, part of a temporary exhibit titled Behind the Lens, The Unseen Architects. It was quiet save for the soft shuffle of rubber-soled shoes. Across polished wood, Maribel stood before a painting titled The Shadow Partner, a grayscale oil depiction of a woman's silhouette standing just behind a man at a podium. The man beamed at a crowd. The woman stared at the back of his head, one hand full of cue cards, the other curled tightly into a fist. Maribel hadn't been here for media. She needed no cameras today. No statement, no war face. This was reflection. She'd spent the last few months in a whirlwind of speaking engagements, television, interviews, and strategy meetings with the non-profit board of Dead Weight Rising. But for the first time in nearly a year, she wasn't preparing for anything. No lawsuit, no ambush, no applause, just silence. And after 37 years of noise, that silence felt like something holy. Do you ever get used to people knowing everything? She had asked Simone one night after another interview went viral. Simone had laughed and replied, "No, but you get good at choosing what they don't." That stuck with her. Now, standing in this gallery, Maribel saw herself in the silhouette, not just the woman erased, but the woman watching, learning, documenting, remembering, preparing. The exhibit's curator, a tall woman with soft grey curls and horn-rimmed glasses, approached her quietly. "Ms. Ortiz," she said, offering a knowing smile, "you're the reason this show got funded. I just wanted to say thank you. And to tell you, there's a portrait of you in the next room." Maribel blinked. "Me?" It was added last night, a young artist submitted at last minute. Said she owed her entire sense of professional courage to your story. It's called Not Dead Yet. Maribel followed the curator into a side gallery and found it there, an acrylic piece in bold colours, her face framed by golden text reading, "Truth is not defamation." The room spun slightly. In that moment, the full weight of what she had done, what she had survived, resisted, redefined, hit her like gravity. Remembering to act. It wasn't about destroying Julian anymore. It hadn't been for some time. It was about reclaiming her own life, on her own terms. And now that she had it, she had to decide what next. The following Monday, Maribel was back in the office of Dead Weight Rising. The non-profit had grown faster than expected. What began as a viral hashtag and a support network for women in media had evolved into a multifaceted organization providing legal support, public relations coaching, mental health counseling, and professional mentoring for women across industries. There were now 12 full-time staffers, 70 active volunteers, and more than 8,000 members in their online platform, which Alana had built in under 2 months using open-source community tools and a little help from a coder friend at Northwestern. Alana, I don't say this enough, Maribel said during their weekly staff meeting. But you're not just my niece, you're my co-architect in this, Alana beamed. And I don't say this enough, but if you'd listened to me back in 2019 and gone on TikTok earlier, this whole revolution could have started during lockdown. The room laughed at first. Maribel had resisted the idea that she was the face of a movement. She told Simone, I didn't survive Julian just to become another brand. But over time, she realized it wasn't about being a brand. It was about being a beacon, a lighthouse for other women navigating the same fog. Their next initiative was ambitious, a fellowship program placing mid-career women in media, law, and tech into mentorship roles at companies committed to equity and transparency. There would be metrics, contracts, oversight. They were going to systematize fairness in industries where merit had long been a euphemism for who you know and what you're willing to swallow. At first, several corporations had hesitated. Julian's allies had quietly warned them that working with Maribel might attract attention from conservative media. But public support was fierce, and companies that joined early, Netflix, NPR, Vox's saw bumps in both morale and recruitment. By June, the program was fully funded. By August, they had more applicants than slots. By November, they published their first white paper on equity violations in media partnerships, written by Maribel and reviewed by legal scholars from Georgetown, NYU, and Howard. It opened with a single sentence, there is no legacy more fragile than a lie dressed up as leadership. Julian, meanwhile, had vanished from public life. After the court's dismissal of his lawsuit, his reputation never recovered. Multiple former employees broke NDAs and gave joint interviews to the New York Times and The Cut. An independent audit of Becker Media Group, prompted by shareholder pressure, uncovered years of financial misrepresentation. Within 6 weeks, Julian had been ousted from his own company, which quietly rebranded as Open Horizon Media and issued a public apology for the erasure of foundational partners in its formation. Rumour had it Julian moved to a private island in Maine and was writing a memoir titled The Burden of Brilliance. No publisher had officially acquired it, at least not yet. Maribel didn't care. For the first time in 4 decades, she didn't know what Julian was doing, and it felt exactly like freedom. In early winter, Maribel returned to WGN the network, where it had all begun, to give a guest lecture to a class of new producers. The classroom smelled of coffee and ambition. She wore a black blazer, sharp boots, and the earrings her mother had left her, simple gold hoops from a vendor in Pilsen who used to call her Modrella Estrella. She stood at the whiteboard and asked the 20 or so students a simple question. What's the most dangerous lie in our industry? Hands went up. That ratings determine value, that women can't direct hard news, that diversity is a liability. Good guesses, Maribel said. But the most dangerous lie is that you are replaceable. She let the silence settle. Every time someone tells you to stay quiet to protect your career, they're telling you you're replaceable. Every time someone takes your idea and presents it as their own, they're saying you're replaceable. Every time someone erases your name from a byline or keeps you off the credits or gives the awards speech without mentioning you, that's them rewriting history, so you don't get to exist in it. She paused. You are not replaceable. You are not a phase. You are not dead weight. The class burst into applause. One student in the back was crying. Afterward, a young producer named Janelle approached her. Ms. Ortiz, do you think things are getting better? Maribel smiled. They're getting louder, and sometimes that's how better begins. On the 1-year anniversary of her Truth NT interview, Maribel stood once more in front of a television camera. This time, it was for the keynote address at the annual Women in Media Summit. The event had moved to a larger venue due to demand. Nearly 5,000 attendees, from interns to Emmy winners, gathered in person, with another 30,000 watching via live stream. Her speech was titled The Power of Unmuting. Sometimes, she began, survival teaches you silence. You think that if you just keep working, keep proving, keep creating, someone will eventually recognize your value. But recognition isn't justice, and silence doesn't protect you. It preserves the myth that those who took from you were always meant to succeed. She spoke of legacy, erasure, betrayal, and the strength of storytelling when it belongs to those who lived it. She honored the women who came before her and the ones who had yet to find their voice. But her final words were the ones that echoed through the halls, through inboxes, through hashtags and stitched videos and conference rooms where women sat beside men who'd once called them assistants instead of co-creators. Maribel stepped forward, looked into the camera, and said, "We were never dead weight. We were ballast, and when you cut us loose, you made yourselves easier to sink." The standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. That night, alone in her apartment, Maribel made herself tea and walked to the window that overlooked Lake Michigan. The lake was frozen now, moonlight caught in the cracks like silver veins. She remembered standing here the day she first heard Julian's podcast. Remembered the rage, the grief, the clarity. So much had changed. But the water was the same. She sat, opened her notebook, and began writing the first chapter of her memoir. Chapter 1. The partner they forgot to mention. Up next we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.